So welcome, folks. This is our demonstration of the Congressional District Analysis that has been produced by the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative's Environmental Enforcement Watch project. So this is a Jupyter notebook that is available to anyone with a Google account at the following link. So you can run a copy of yourself if you pull up this link and you're logged into a Google account. So a Jupyter notebook intersperses cells of text, like this one here, describing how the notebook is licensed and how it was authored, with cells of code, which we'll see in just a second, as well as cells that include charts, maps, other forms of output from the code and the analysis. So they're pretty straightforward to run if you don't have a programming background. You do have that background, you're able to edit it and intervene and mix it up however you like. But if you don't have that background, it is as simple as pressing play. So I've already pre-run part of this notebook. And so I won't necessarily press play on all these cells, but this first one here actually just loads in some data that we'll use in the rest of the notebook. So if I run this, it'll take a second, and then it'll print done. And I can see the code here if I go ahead and do that, but it's not necessary. So here, we're just giving you a sense of what this analysis can start to look like, or what sort of data that we're looking at for. So we've pre-calculated some metrics that we store in a database for each congressional district in the country. So each dot here represents one of those congressional districts, and the metrics here relate to Clean Air Act inspections in that district out of 1,000 regulated facilities. How many inspections do we see? And the same here with violations. So for instance, this dot out here, this district, we see nearly 3,000 inspections over the past 5 years per 1,000 facilities. So a lot of inspections being done, and maybe 750 violations per 1,000 facilities over the past 5 years. So, a lot of inspections being done, a lot of violations being found. This really gives us a kind of sense of how inspections are turning into violations or not. Now, this is fairly limited, right? Because we don't, just in this chart, we can't see which districts they are. We don't know any of their spatial dimensions. So we're going to actually map this out. In here, we go and get some of that information. This is just congressional districts and the 118th Congress mapped out here. And now we're going to look at what each metric looks like mapped out across the country. So by default, we are looking at the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA. And here we're looking at the percent of facilities in violation, or actually the percentile that district scores in terms of violations of RCRA over the past 5 years. So what that means basically is how many congressional districts is a specific district doing worse at when it comes to violations. Maybe it'll be clear if we look at a specific example here. So if we zoom in, the darker shades of red here are higher values. So if we look at basically any district in Kentucky, we see scores somewhere between 0.8 and 1, which means that these districts are ranked higher or worse when it comes to violations of RCRA over the past 5 years than 80% of all other districts in the country. And we see how this trend plays out across the country. Washington, Utah, Missouri, Arkansas, Kentucky, New Hampshire, these states tend to be ranked higher when it comes to relative to other districts in the country. So that's just one of the metrics that we're mapping out here. We wanted to look at Clean Water Act inspections per 1,000 facilities. Well, the average for the US is about 100 out of 1,000 facilities. So basically, over 5 years, we're only the US and state EPA agencies are only looking at 10% of all facilities in most districts. And we see that here. We see some states, it does tend to fall along state lines because environmental protection laws are implemented at a state level and data about them are reported at the state level. So we see like Iowa, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Oklahoma are reporting more Clean Water Act inspections per 1,000 facilities than other states. Let's see what's Clean Air Act inspections. We'll look at that since we saw it up here as well. So we actually map this out. We see certain states and parts of states reporting higher inspection rates. So Central Valley in California seems to be some of the highest inspection rates in the country. Other states in the south and east reporting high rates. But if we look at violations, we see, not particularly high rates anywhere, real sort of outliers here in the Central Valley where we are seeing more inspections. So that's the past 5 years. But if we want to look at the longer term to analyze whether we see any patterns in political administration, we can look back to 2001, which was when the US EPA says this data is probably as reliable as it gets. And just to keep in mind here, again, environmental protection laws are implemented at the state level. The data we're seeing here are states reporting it to the US EPA where we grab it. So states are really the ones on the hook here for this information. And, of course, some states are going to be maybe dragging their feet in submitting that data, or it might have more errors than other states. All important things to keep in mind. So if we look at nationwide trends since 2001, we're looking here at RCRA. We see generally a decrease in inspections reported overall since basically the Obama administration, especially drop-offs in 2020 with the pandemic. Maybe sort of resurgence in the Biden administration, perhaps. But that might just be recovering from the pandemic drop-off in 2020. Violations follow inspections, generally, under most programs, because you inspect a facility, you find out whether there's a violation. That'll be different with the Clean Water Act, which we'll look at in a second. Enforcement actions also just dropping since the Obama administration. So really, we might be, we're not finding as many violations. EPA is probably not taking enforcement actions. Penalties tend to be variable just based on the willingness of the administration, I suppose. Let's take a look at the Clean Water Act, which is a little bit different and perhaps includes more reliable data because it involves automatic reporting of certain pieces of information directly to the US EPA. So we see a lot more inspections being reported under the Clean Water Act since 2016 or so. A rise in the number of violations reported, in part because monitoring data is being directly reported to the EPA and violations can be automatically flagged. Enforcement actions are up since the Biden administration. Penalties, you have kind of outlier years here actually in 2012. So what does that look like spatially? These are national trends over time. Let's map out these using different metrics. This first one that we're looking at is actually RCRA violations and where we have places that, recently were under the long-term average. So basically places where we're seeing fewer RCRA violations last year, 2023, than we saw, on average over the past 20 plus years. So that's places like Kansas, Vermont, certain parts of, Iowa, Midwest, different parts of states here. Where do we see fewer RCRA inspections recently compared to the long-term average? It varies, but Southern New Jersey is a standout here, as well as Western Kentucky. We look at Clean Water Act inspections, where we're seeing fewer inspections than that long-term average. Illinois really stands out here. We can also look at sort of, if we look at violations, we can look at above long-term averages. So we're seeing more violations of the Clean Water Act in these places compared to the long-term average. Now, we saw in the trend above, in general, more violations recently compared to the past 20 years. These are the places that are really seeing more Clean Water Act violations, especially southern West Virginia, those being reported more. Southern Illinois, despite fewer inspections, so on and so forth. So, this concludes our demonstration of the Congressional District Analysis.